bright, your perfume fills my head. The stars get red and all the nights so blue.
What really happened behind the doors of Hollywood's most polished marriage? Was Nicole Kidman the fairy tale bride, or a woman quietly erased from her own life? For years, the world watched Nicole Kidman walk beside Tom Cruise, the golden couple of the 1990s. Together, they graced red carpets with effortless charm, whispered elegance, and smiles that masked a deeper truth. But when Cruise abruptly filed for divorce in 2001, just days after their 10th anniversary, Nicole was blindsided. What followed was more than heartbreak. It was the unmasking of a life built on silence, control, and secrets that no one dared to speak of. Few knew what Nicole was truly enduring behind the flash of cameras and studio lights. The daughter of a feminist psychologist, she had once seemed destined for independence. But in the shadow of her megastar husband, she lived a different reality, one shaped by power, paranoia, and the chilling grip of the Church of Scientology. Was she pushed aside because she didn't conform? Was she seen as a threat by a system far bigger than marriage? Her own adopted children would later refer to her not as mom, but as a suppressive person. How did the image of the devoted wife unravel into something so cold, so public, and so tragically one-sided? This is not the story of Hollywood's success. It's the story of what success tried to erase. Nicole Kidman, the porcelain doll of the screen, once cracked wide open, revealing a woman who had to rebuild everything, including her own voice. Nicole Kidman wasn't just another actress rising through the ranks. She was Australia's most radiant export to Hollywood. With her striking height, ethereal beauty, and classical training, she appeared destined for the stage. But fate had other plans. In 1989, while filming Days of Thunder, a 22-year-old Nicole met Tom Cruise. He was already a global icon, and she was still an emerging talent. Their meeting would change not just her career, but her entire identity. The 1990s became the decade of Nicole and Tom. They starred together, married quickly, adopted 2 children, and formed what appeared to be a seamless power couple. Hollywood embraced them, magazines worshipped them, and audiences saw in them the embodiment of modern royalty. But underneath the surface, something colder stirred. Tom Cruise was not just an actor. He was the most visible disciple of the Church of Scientology. And from the moment Nicole entered his life, she also stepped into the complex, shadowy world of this powerful religious organization. What few realized then was how much this would define and distort her reality. Reports would later suggest that high-ranking members of Scientology never approved of Nicole. She was seen as an outsider, someone who might draw Tom away from the church's grasp. Despite her efforts to be part of his world, she never fully converted. This subtle rejection, this invisible wall between her and the faith, would slowly evolve into something far more destructive. Even as she won praise for her acting, in To Die For, The Portrait of a Lady, Eyes Wide Shut, there was always the underlying narrative of her being Cruise's wife. Her achievements, no matter how profound, were often overshadowed by his towering presence. The press loved the glamour, but rarely questioned the imbalance. Behind closed doors, the strain was growing. Nicole once admitted she longed to retreat into the normalcy of motherhood and avoid Hollywood's spotlight. But how could she? She was married to a man who thrived in it and surrounded by forces that never wanted her to stand on her own. When the divorce came, it was swift and brutal. Tom Cruise cited irreconcilable differences, but Nicole, in her own words, was devastated. She had just discovered she was pregnant and miscarried shortly after. She later said, "I thought our life was perfect. I thought we were going to be together forever." What was once the fairy tale now seemed more like a script someone else had written, and she had merely played the role. The question was no longer why they divorced. It was what had been happening all along. Nicole Kidman's beginnings were far from the artificial gloss of Hollywood. Born in Honolulu to Australian parents, she moved back to Sydney at a young age. Her father, a clinical psychologist, instilled in her a profound sense of introspection. Nicole wasn't chasing fame, she was chasing expression. She studied ballet, mime, and eventually acting, showing early brilliance that felt both instinctual and hauntingly mature. Her breakout role came with Dead Calm, 1989, a psychological thriller that proved she could command the screen with unsettling nuance. At just 21, critics hailed her as a revelation. But it was Days of Thunder that shifted her trajectory, and not just professionally. On that set, she met Tom Cruise. Within a year, she was married, moved to Los Angeles, and became part of a carefully curated image. The glamorous, silent wife to the most bankable man in Hollywood. At first, their union seemed charmed. Nicole joined Tom on international press tours, accepted awards at his side, and starred opposite him in Far and Away and Eyes Wide Shut. But within that glittering bubble, cracks began to show. Nicole's own career flourished independently. She was praised for To Die For, 1995, a dark satire that showcased her ability to play ambitious, morally ambiguous women. But with each personal success came professional complications. Hollywood whispered about the imbalance of power in their marriage. Nicole often looked subdued, even anxious, when compared to Tom's charisma. Directors reportedly found her difficult to cast. She was too high profile to be anonymous, too tethered to Cruise's brand to be her own woman. Then came Eyes Wide Shut, a psychological descent into marital breakdown, filmed by Stanley Kubrick over a grueling 15-month shoot. The eerie parallels to their real marriage were impossible to ignore. In the film, Nicole's character confesses to fantasies, yearnings, and repressed pain. Behind the scenes, their relationship reportedly strained under Kubrick's intense direction and the emotional exposure required. The finished film, though critically debated, remains a surreal time capsule of their final years together. And yet, the public knew nothing. Nicole smiled on red carpets. She thanked Tom at award shows. They adopted 2 children, Isabella and Connor, and continued the facade of stability. But cracks had widened into canyons. In 2001, when Tom Cruise filed for divorce, Nicole was unprepared. He told the press they had simply grown apart. She said nothing, except heartbreakingly, he just came home one day and told me it was over. Then came the miscarriage. Then came the isolation. The children, still young, chose to live with Tom. Nicole never publicly explained why. In later interviews, she would say, "My children are adults. They make their own choices." But those choices, many believe, were shaped by Scientology, a force that had already determined Nicole's place in their world, outside. Yet amid the emotional wreckage, something else stirred. Nicole began choosing darker, riskier roles. The others, Moulin Rouge, and ultimately The Hours, for which she won the Academy Award, were all performances that seemed to bleed her truth. No longer the silent wife, she became the wounded woman, the survivor, the ghost who refused to vanish. Her rise after the fall was not loud, it was deliberate. Each role was a reclamation of self, a subtle defiance of the system that once silenced her. But scars remained, hidden under layers of poise, glamour, and an ever-present distance in her eyes. What the public never fully grasped was the emotional architecture behind Nicole Kidman's silence. It wasn't mere discretion, it was survival. At the heart of her fractured world was the all-encompassing presence of Scientology, a force that didn't just influence her marriage, but may have actively worked to dismantle it from within. According to former high-ranking members of the church, Nicole was seen as a liability. She was never fully on board, reportedly skeptical of the church's practices and teachings. In Scientology's inner lexicon, she was labeled a potential trouble source. That label alone was enough to initiate quiet measures, surveillance, pressure, even emotional separation from her children. Ex-Scientologists like Marty Rathbun and Mike Rinder have publicly claimed that church officials orchestrated a campaign to turn Tom against Nicole. They allegedly listened in on phone calls, monitored her activities, and ultimately painted her as a threat to Tom's spiritual progress. Whether or not these accusations are fully provable, the pattern that emerged was chilling. Nicole was pushed further to the margins, not just as a wife, but as a mother. After the divorce, Isabella and Connor remained with Tom and the church. Nicole rarely spoke of them in public. At red carpet events, she would be alone. In interviews, her face stiffened when asked about her children. In 2018, when she accepted a Golden Globe, she thanked her daughters with Keith Urban, but didn't mention Isabella or Connor. The silence was deafening. Years later, when asked if she still had a relationship with them, Nicole offered only. They are adults now. They have made choices. My job is to love them. Behind that restrained answer was a hurricane of unspoken grief. Insiders have speculated that Nicole's spiritual resistance and her strong-willed independence were exactly what alienated her from Scientology's world. She couldn't be molded. She couldn't be tamed. And in a system that demands absolute loyalty, that made her expendable. It wasn't just the church. Hollywood, too, had typecast her as the icy blonde, the enigmatic beauty. But in truth, she was bleeding under the surface. Films like Birth and Dogville tapped into her raw interiority. In The Hours, playing Virginia Woolf, Nicole said she felt like she was exorcising something deeply buried. That role won her an Oscar, but more importantly, it gave her back her identity. The public's reaction was both admiring and curious. Why did she speak so little of her past? Why did she never name names, never retaliate, never explain? Because perhaps the damage was too complex, too intimate, too spiritually entangled to unravel in sound bites. And yet, fragments emerged. She once admitted, "I was so young when I got married. I look back now and realize I didn't really know myself." In another moment, she said, "I became more famous during the marriage, but I felt smaller." Behind every composed appearance was a woman who had been erased, reprogrammed, and slowly rebuilt herself through the roles she played. Each character, a shard of the truth she couldn't say aloud. She became her own witness, her own storyteller, and in doing so reclaimed what others tried to strip away, her voice. The story isn't just about fame, beauty, or talent. It's about a woman navigating a system that tried to define her, contain her, and ultimately erase her. At Aussie Uncovered, we view her not as a victim, but as a survivor of both personal and institutional forces far greater than herself. It's easy to look at Nicole now, regal, poised, Oscar-winning, and forget the years when she stood in the shadows of a man, a church, and a culture that preferred her silent. But we must not forget, because her silence was not weakness, it was resistance, and her eventual rise wasn't handed to her. It was earned through trauma, choice, and an unrelenting pursuit of identity. Many will argue that Nicole Kidman was complicit, that she allowed herself to be controlled or stayed too long. But those criticisms often ignore the complexity of emotional entrapment, especially in a world as insular and orchestrated as Tom Cruise's. What Nicole endured was not just a broken marriage, it was institutional alienation, maternal grief, and psychological displacement. Yet through art, she fought back. Every role she chose post-divorce was a subtle middle finger to the narrative others tried to write for her. The others gave her strength in vulnerability. Moulin Rouge gave her control over her own sensuality. And The Hours gave her the pain of Wolf, brilliant, misunderstood, and quietly breaking inside. What resonates most is her restraint. She never lashed out. She never published a tell-all memoir or gave a venomous interview. Instead, she let her silence speak volumes. That silence, when framed by her work, becomes powerful, haunting, a kind of scream that only those paying attention could hear. We believe Nicole Kidman's legacy is not just about acting. It's about endurance. The dignity of surviving a system that chews people up and spits out their stories without mercy. The courage of holding on to yourself, even when everything else has been taken. Her journey invites questions. How many other women live in those same shadows? How often does celebrity serve as a mask for control and fear? And how do we recognize strength in forms that don't roar, but whisper? Now we turn to you. What do you see when you look at Nicole Kidman? A star? A symbol? Or something more difficult to define? Someone who lived a life written by others until she found the pen herself? Stories never scream. They whisper through stolen glances, restrained interviews, and the hollow silence between camera flashes. Nicole Kidman's life is one of those stories. When we see her now, walking across the stage in a couture gown, her voice calm, her smile distant, it's easy to believe she's always belonged there. But knowing what we know, the truth adds weight to her elegance. Every graceful step feels like a quiet rebellion against a past that once held her captive. She never told us everything. She didn't have to. The pain showed in her eyes long before it ever made its way into the scripts she chose. Films became her confessions, each one pulling back another veil. And with each performance, she stitched herself back together. Not for us, but for her. What remains is a haunting legacy, not of scandal, but of survival. Not of collapse, but of composure. Nicole Kidman didn't escape the shadows by running from them. She stood still until the shadows moved behind her. In a world that punishes women for either being too quiet or too loud, she found a third path: speaking through silence, living through characters, healing through art. And maybe that's why we still watch her so closely. Because behind the perfect mask, we sense something unfinished, a story that was nearly stolen but somehow survived. Some stories are never told, but now you know.